We're sitting around a crackling campfire in the heart of a dense forest, surrounded by tall trees and the sounds of rustling leaves. The fire casts flickering shadows against the trees, creating an eerie dance of light and dark. Every now and then you hear a twig snap or a branch creak, making you wonder what kind of creatures might be lurking in the darkness. As we sit here, I want to tell you a story I heard a while ago. It's a tale about a group of hikers who went on a trip like this one into the same kind of forest. They were young, adventurous, and eager to explore the great outdoors. They had no idea what kind of terror awaited them. As the group hiked deeper into the forest, the beauty that surrounded them became increasingly surreal. The trees seemed to grow taller, and the shadows grew longer, as if the forest itself was closing in around them. The wind picked up, carrying whispers and whispers on the breeze, although there was no one around to make them. The hikers could feel eyes upon them, watching their every move from the shadows. Despite these strange occurrences, the group pressed on, determined to reach their destination. But as they hiked, the shadows seemed to follow them, darting from tree to tree just out of the corner of their eye. At night, they would hear strange noises, like the sound of footsteps coming closer and then fading away. It was as if something was stalking them, tracking their every move. And then, just as the sun began to set and the light began to fade, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin in the middle of the woods. The cabin was covered in cobwebs and vines, and it looked as though it had been abandoned for years. Despite its dilapidated state, the hikers decided to take shelter there for the night. The cabin seemed to offer a sense of safety, a place to rest and regroup after a long day of hiking. But as soon as they entered, they could feel a presence, a cold and malevolent energy that seemed to be watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. As they settled in, they realized that they weren't alone in the cabin. They could feel a presence, a cold, malevolent energy that seemed to be watching them. And then they heard it, the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and the figure began to take shape in the shadows. The fire flickered, casting an eerie glow across the room, and for a moment the group could see the figure more clearly. It was a human-like figure, but its skin was stretched tight over its bones, giving it a skeletal appearance. Its eyes were black, empty voids, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. As the figure stepped into the light of the fire, the group could see that its long arms ended in razor-sharp claws. It took another step forward, and the group backed away in terror. The figure reached out with its claws, as if to grab them, and then it spoke again. This time, the voice was more defined, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the depths of the forest itself. The group tried to run, but they found that their legs wouldn't move. They were frozen in terror, paralyzed by the figure's presence. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the darkness. The group was left alone, shivering and bewildered, unsure of what had just happened. As they huddled together, they could feel the malevolent energy that filled the cabin, and they knew that they had to get out of there. But they were too afraid to move, too afraid that the figure would come back. And so they stayed there, huddled together and waiting for the first light of dawn. When the first light of dawn finally came, the group gathered their things and made their way out of the cabin as quickly as they could. They didn't dare look back, for fear that the figure would be there, waiting for them. They ran through the forest, their hearts pounding with fear and their minds racing with the horrors they had experienced. As they ran, they could feel the malevolent energy that had filled the cabin slowly fading away, but the memory of what they had seen and heard stayed with them. They finally stumbled out of the forest and into the sunlight, where they collapsed onto the ground, exhausted and shaken. The group never spoke of what had happened in the forest, but they all knew that they would never be the same again. The memory of the figure and its haunting voice stayed with them, a constant reminder of the terror they had experienced. Some say that even to this day, the the figure still haunts the forest, waiting for its next victims. And that's the story, my friend. Just a reminder that sometimes the greatest horrors lurk in the places where we feel the safest. Now let's try to get some rest, but keep close to the fire, as you never know what might be lurking in the darkness.
Once upon a time, 5 friends, Alex, Brian, Caitlin, David, and Emma, decided to go on a camping trip in the forest. The forest was known for its eerie atmosphere and legends of paranormal activities that occurred in the area, but the friends didn't believe in those legends and wanted to explore the forest and have fun. The group arrived at the campsite and set up their tents. They spent the day hiking and swimming in the nearby river. As night approached, they gathered around the campfire and started telling ghost stories. Caitlin shared the legend of the shadow people, entities that lurked in the forest and were said to possess anyone who entered their territory. The group laughed it off, dismissing it as a mere myth. As the night wore on, the group retired to their tents. Emma and Caitlin shared one tent, while Alex, Brian, and David slept in another. It was a peaceful night until they were awakened by rustling outside their tents. They assumed it was just an animal and went back to sleep. But then they heard strange whispers, like voices they couldn't understand. The next morning, they discovered that their food supplies had been ransacked and their belongings had been scattered all over the campsite. The group was scared, and their once relaxed mood had turned into a tense one. They decided to leave the forest, but as they were packing up, they realized that David was missing. They searched the forest but couldn't find David. They called out his name, but there was no response. Just as they were about to give up, they heard his voice, but it was faint and distant. They followed the sound and found David in a clearing, but he was acting strange. His eyes were empty, and his body was rigid, as if he was in a trance. The group tried to shake David out of it, but he didn't respond. They decided to take him back to the city and seek medical help. As they were leaving the forest, they noticed that the trees around them seemed to be closing in, almost as if they were trying to keep them inside. Once they reached the city, they took David to the hospital. The doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong with him, but his mental state had deteriorated. He was in a catatonic state and didn't respond to any external stimuli. The group was devastated, and they felt responsible for what had happened to David. A few days later, they received a call from the hospital. David had woken up and was asking for them. They rushed to the hospital and found David sitting upright, with a look of terror on his face. He told them that he had seen something in the forest, something that he couldn't explain. David explained that he had been walking in the forest when he saw a shadowy figure watching him from the trees. The figure had glowing eyes and seemed to be beckoning him. David had tried to run away, but the figure had pursued him, and he couldn't escape its grasp. The group was horrified by David's account, and they decided to return to the forest to investigate. As they entered the forest, they felt a sense of foreboding, but they pressed on. Suddenly, they heard a blood-curdling scream. It was Emma. They ran to her tent and found it empty, except for a note that read, "They are watching us." The group frantically searched the forest for Emma, but they couldn't find her. They were lost and scared, and they didn't know what to do. As they stumbled around, they came across an old cabin, hidden deep in the forest. They cautiously entered the cabin, and what they saw inside left them paralyzed with fear. The cabin was dark and musty, with cobwebs covering every surface. The group could barely make out the shape of furniture in the gloom, and a putrid smell emanated from the corners of the room. As they entered further into the cabin, they saw that the walls were adorned with strange symbols and drawings that seemed to depict the shadowy figures that David had described. The group was paralyzed with fear, and they knew that they had stumbled onto something that was beyond their understanding. Suddenly, they heard footsteps behind them, and they turned to see a figure in the doorway. It was Emma, but she was not alone. Behind her stood a shadowy figure, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through their souls. The group tried to run, but they were stopped by a force that seemed to hold them in place. The shadowy figure advanced towards them, and they knew that they were trapped. Just as the figure was about to consume them, a bright light flooded the room, and the figure dissipated into nothingness. The group looked around, confused and disorientated, but they knew that they were safe. They stumbled out of the cabin and into the forest, and as they looked back, they saw that the cabin had disappeared. It was as if it had never been there. The group made it back to the city, shaken and traumatized by their experience. They knew that they had encountered something that was beyond their understanding, something that had consumed their friend and nearly taken them as well. In the weeks that followed, the group tried to forget what had happened, but they couldn't. They knew that they had witnessed something that was truly terrifying, something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Years went by, and the group drifted apart, each carrying the memory of that night with them. But one thing remained constant, the knowledge that they had encountered something that was not of this world, something that lurked in the darkness and was waiting to consume them. Despite their best efforts, the group couldn't shake off the feeling that they were being watched, even when they were far away from the forest. They started experiencing nightmares and vivid hallucinations that made it difficult to distinguish reality from their imaginations. Emma was the first to succumb to the madness. She was found wandering the streets, muttering incoherently about shadowy figures and dark rituals. The group tried to help her, but it was too late. She was consumed by the darkness that had taken hold of her mind. One by one, the others fell victim to the same fate. Alex was found hanging from a tree in the park, with strange symbols carved into his skin. Ryan was discovered in his apartment, his body twisted into an unnatural shape. Caitlin was last seen entering the forest, never to be seen again. David was the only one who survived, but he was a shell of his former self. He spent his days in a psychiatric hospital, babbling about the shadowy figures that had consumed his friends. Years went by, and the legend of the shadow people became a cautionary tale, whispered in hushed tones by those who dared to enter the forest. Some claimed to have seen the figures themselves, lurking in the darkness and waiting for their next victim. But there was one thing that remained a mystery: the source of the darkness that had consumed the group. Some claimed that it was a curse that had been placed on the forest by an ancient tribe. Others believed that it was a portal to another dimension that had been opened by a group of occultists. Regardless of the source, one thing was clear: the forest was a place of darkness and terror, a place where the line between reality and madness was blurred. And so the legend of the shadow people lived on, a warning to those who dared to enter the forest and a testament to the darkness that lurks within us all. Years passed, and the forest had become a place of fear, avoided by all who knew of the legend of the shadow people. But one day, a group of curious teenagers decided to venture into the forest, believing the stories to be nothing more than myths. As they wandered deeper into the forest, they began to feel a sense of unease, as if they were being watched. Suddenly, they heard a voice calling out to them, beckoning them deeper into the darkness. They followed the voice, and soon they found themselves in a clearing, surrounded by trees that seemed to be alive, twisting and writhing in the wind. And then they saw them, the shadow people, emerging from the darkness with glowing eyes that pierced through their souls. The group tried to run, but it was too late. The shadow people had them in their grasp, pulling them deeper into the darkness. And then there was nothing but silence. The legend of the shadow people had claimed its latest victims, and the forest had claimed their souls. But there were those who claimed that the spirits of the group still roamed the forest, trapped in a perpetual state of fear and madness. And so the legend of the shadow people lived on, a testament to the darkness that lurks within us all, waiting to consume us if we dare to venture too close.
It was a beautiful summer day when Sarah and Jake decided to go for a hike in the forest. The sun was shining and the birds were chirping, making for the perfect backdrop for their adventure. As they wandered deeper into the forest, they were amazed by the vibrant colors around them. The trees were lush and green, and the leaves of every hue of the rainbow shimmered in the sunlight. At first, everything was going great. Sarah and Jake took in the sights and sounds of the forest, chatting and laughing as they walked. But as they continued on, they noticed that the colors around them were starting to fade. The once vibrant greens and yellows were turning a sickly brown, and the trees seemed to close in around them. Sarah and Jake started to feel a sense of unease, and their laughter faded into silence. The only sound they could hear was the crunching of twigs and leaves underfoot. They picked up their pace, but no matter how fast they walked, the trees seemed to be closing in even more. It was then that they realized that they were lost. The path they had been following was no longer visible, and the forest around them was unfamiliar. They tried retracing their steps, but nothing looked familiar. They were completely lost. As the hours passed, the sun started to set, and the forest became even more oppressive. The darkness was deepening, and strange noises echoed all around them. Sarah and Jake huddled close together, both feeling a deep sense of dread. Then they heard a rustling in the bushes. They cautiously approached the sound, but as they peered into the undergrowth, they saw nothing but darkness. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, and they stumbled back in terror. It was a figure like nothing they had ever seen before. Its eyes were a bright, fiery red, and its skin was a sickly shade of green. Its mouth was twisted into a snarl, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. Sarah and Jake were frozen in fear, but the figure lunged at them, and they ran as fast as they could in the opposite direction. They ran and ran, but the figure was always there, just a step behind them. Sarah and Jake were exhausted and terrified, but they didn't stop running until they stumbled upon a small clearing. And there they stayed, huddled together, not daring to move or make a sound. They knew that the figure was still out there, watching and waiting. They were trapped, lost in the forest with no way out. As the night grew darker, Sarah and Jake could feel their fear growing with every passing moment. They didn't dare to light a fire, for fear that the figure would find them. They whispered quietly to each other, trying to come up with a plan, but their minds were blank. They were completely at a loss. Suddenly, they heard a soft rustling in the bushes. They held their breath, not daring to make a sound. The rustling grew louder, and they could see the bushes shaking. They braced themselves for the worst, but then, to their surprise, a small creature emerged from the undergrowth. It was a rabbit, its eyes wide with fear. It looked up at them and then scurried off into the darkness. Sarah and Jake were stunned. They had never seen an animal behave so strangely before. But then they heard another rustling in the bushes, this time closer. They rose to their feet, ready to run if they had to. But then they saw a figure emerging from the darkness, and they realized that they were no longer alone in the forest. It was an old man, his face lined with years of experience. He approached them slowly, and they could see that he was carrying a small lantern. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "I am the caretaker of this forest," the old man replied. "I have lived here for many years, and I know these woods like the back of my hand. What brings you here, so deep in the forest?" Sarah and Jake told the old man about the figure that had been hunting them, and the old man listened intently. When they had finished, he nodded his head. The old man's eyes were piercing, seeming to look right through Sarah and Jake. His voice was deep and steady, and it held a note of authority that commanded their attention. He took a step closer to them, and they could see that his lantern was made of an old rusty metal, with intricate designs etched into it. The light from the lantern flickered, casting strange shadows on the old man's face, and giving him an almost otherworldly appearance. "This spirit has been a curse on these woods for as long as anyone can remember," the old man continued. "It preys on those who are lost and afraid, and it feeds on their fear. But I have learned how to banish it, and I will show you the way." Sarah and Jake followed the old man as he led them deeper into the forest. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches reaching out like bony fingers, and their leaves rustled ominously in the wind. They could feel the spirit watching them from the darkness, and they were filled with a sense of dread. The old man led them to a small clearing, where a circle of stones had been laid in the ground. The stones were ancient, and they were etched with strange symbols that glowed in the moonlight. The old man took a pouch from his pocket, and he sprinkled a powder over the stones, muttering an incantation as he did so. As he finished speaking, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, and the trees swayed back and forth. The wind grew stronger, and the trees began to creak and groan. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the center of the clearing, its eyes glowing with an evil light. The old man stepped forward, facing the figure with a steady gaze. He raised his lantern high, and the light shone like a beacon in the darkness. He spoke a word of power, and the figure let out a blood-curdling scream. Then, with a final burst of wind, it vanished into the night, never to be seen again. The old man turned to Sarah and Jake, and they could see that he was smiling. "It is done," he said. "You are safe now. The spirit has been banished, and it will not harm anyone." Sarah and Jake thanked the old man, and they left the forest, never to return. They never forgot the strange and frightening events that had taken place there, but they were grateful to be alive.
Once, there was a young couple named Max and Lily. They were both avid hikers and loved spending time in the great outdoors. One weekend, they decided to go camping in a remote area of the woods, far from civilization. They packed their gear and set out on a journey into the wilderness. The first day of their camping trip was uneventful. They hiked for several miles and set up camp near a small river. They built a fire and cooked their dinner, then settled in for the night. They fell asleep to the soothing sound of the rushing water, feeling safe and secure in their little tent. The next morning, they woke up to a strange noise outside their tent. It sounded like something was scratching at the fabric. Max unzipped the tent flap and peered outside, but he didn't see anything. He shrugged it off as an animal and went back to sleep. Later that day, they decided to go on a hike. They packed some food and water and set out into the woods. As they walked, they noticed that the woods were eerily quiet. There were no birds singing or animals scurrying about. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. After a few hours of hiking, they came to a clearing. In the center of the clearing, there was a circle of stones. Max and Lily were fascinated by the stones and decided to explore them. As they approached the stones, they heard a faint whispering sound. They couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sent chills down their spines. Suddenly, Max felt a hand on his shoulder. He spun around, but there was no one there. He looked at Lily, but she was just as puzzled as he was. They decided to leave the clearing and head back to camp. That night, they built a fire and sat around it, talking and laughing. But as the night wore on, they became aware of a strange presence in the woods. They could hear footsteps approaching their campsite, but when they shone their flashlight into the darkness, there was no one there. Lily started to feel uneasy. She had a feeling that they were being watched. Max tried to reassure her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. They decided to go to bed, hoping that they would feel better in the morning. But the morning brought no relief. They woke up to find their tent torn to shreds. It looked like something had clawed its way through the fabric, trying to get inside. A pair was terrified. They packed up their gear and started to hike out of the woods as quickly as they could. As they walked, they heard the whispering sound again. It was louder this time, and they could make out what it was saying. It was a warning. It was telling them to leave the woods immediately or suffer the consequences. Max and Lily were running now. They didn't stop until they reached their car. They drove home in silence, both of them still shaken by their experience. When they got home, they went straight to bed, but they couldn't sleep every time they closed their eyes. They saw the stones and heard the whispering sound. They knew that they would never forget their terrifying experience in the woods. Days turned into weeks, and Max and Lily tried to forget their camping experience, but they couldn't shake off the feeling that something was following them. It was as if a creature that had torn their tent in the woods had somehow found its way into their lives. One night, Max woke up to a tapping sound at their bedroom window. At first, he dismissed it as a tree branch or some other harmless noise, but as the tapping continued, he started to feel uneasy. He got out of bed and walked over to the window, peering outside into the darkness. That's when he saw it. There was a figure outside their window. It was humanoid, but its features were twisted and distorted. Its eyes were glowing with a sickly green light, and its skin was pale and waxy. It was tapping on the window with long, clawed fingers, trying to get inside. Max yelled for Lily to wake up, and they both watched in horror as the creature tried to break the glass. They could hear its raspy breathing and the sound of its claws scraping against the window pane. They tried to call for help, but their phone was dead. They were trapped, with no way to defend themselves. The creature kept tapping and scratching at the window, getting more and more agitated by the minute. Finally, Lily had an idea. She remembered that they had a can of bear spray in their camping gear. She ran to get it, hoping that it would be enough to scare off the creature. She came back to the window and sprayed the creature in the face. It recoiled, screeching in pain. Lily kept spraying until the creature turned and ran off into the night. Max and Lily were both shaking with fear, but they were also relieved. They knew that they had survived a terrifying encounter with a supernatural being, and they were determined to never let it happen again. They moved out of their house the next day, determined to leave the creature behind. They never went camping again, and they never spoke of their experience to anyone else. They knew that some things were better left unexplained, and that the woods held secrets that were best left alone. Despite their best efforts to move on, Max and Lily found that their experience had left a lasting impact on their lives. They couldn't shake off the feeling that the creature was still out there, waiting for them. They started to do some research on the history of the woods where they had camped. What they found was chilling. The area was known for mysterious disappearances and sightings of supernatural beings. There were stories of a witch who had been burned at the stake centuries ago and was said to haunt the woods, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to enter her domain. Max and Lily realized that they had stumbled into something far more sinister than they had ever imagined. They knew that they had to find a way to protect themselves from the creature and any other supernatural forces that might be lurking in the shadows. They consulted with experts in the field of paranormal activity and learned about protective rituals and spells that could help ward off evil spirits. They spent hours researching and practicing these rituals, hoping that they would be enough to keep them safe. But even with all their efforts, they still couldn't shake off the feeling that something was watching them. They started to see shadows moving in the corners of their eyes and hear whispers in their ears when no one was around. They knew that they were being haunted by the creature that they had encountered in the woods, and that it wasn't going to give up until it had gotten what it wanted. One night, Max and Lily were sitting in their living room, watching TV. Suddenly, the power went out. They were plunged into darkness, and the silence was deafening. Then they heard the tapping again, coming from the window. They knew that the creature had found them. They tried to light a candle, but it wouldn't stay lit. They were completely defenseless. They could hear the creature outside, scratching at the window and whispering in its raspy voice. Then, all of a sudden, the tapping stopped. Max and Lily held their breath, waiting for the creature to make its next move. But there was nothing. The silence was even more unsettling than the tapping had been. Finally, they mustered up the courage to peek outside. They saw a figure walking away from their house, disappearing into the darkness. It was the same twisted, distorted figure that they had seen outside their tent in the woods. Max and Lily knew that they had to leave their house immediately. They grabbed their car keys and ran outside, not even bothering to pack a bag. They drove until they reached a motel on the outskirts of town, where they spent the night in fear and confusion. The next morning, they knew that they couldn't go back to their house. They had to leave everything behind and start fresh somewhere else. They packed up their car and drove away, leaving behind a life that they had built together. As they drove away, Max and Lily knew that they had been changed forever by their experience in the woods. They had learned that there were things in this world that were far beyond their understanding, and that sometimes the best thing to do was to run away and never look back.
Once upon a time, deep in the heart of a dense forest, there stood an old children's summer camp. The camp was abandoned many years ago, and it was said that the place was cursed. The tall trees swayed ominously in the wind, their branches creaking and groaning like the lamentations of the dead. A thick mist hung over the area, shrouding the camp in an eerie and impenetrable fog. As you approach the camp, you can't help but feel a creeping sense of unease. The once cheerful cabins now stand dilapidated and decrepit, their paint peeling and windows shattered. The old fire pit in the center of the camp is still there, but it is filled with the ashes of countless campfires and surrounded by broken and burned logs. As you're drawn further into the heart of the camp, the mists slowly begin to dissipate, revealing the decrepit form of an ancient amphitheater. The once proud stage is now blanketed in spider webs, the curtains rotted and torn. The seating area is littered with broken and rusted metal chairs, their twisted forms forming a pathway leading up to the stage. But then you hear it once again, that haunting, ghostly laughter. This time, it's louder and more sinister than before, ringing out like a warning across the desolate landscape. You spin on your heel, peering into the mists, but there's no sign of any living thing. You're completely alone, surrounded by the remnants of this long-forgotten place. Suddenly, the mists swirl, as if responding to some unseen presence, and the laughter grows louder still. You feel a chill run down your spine, knowing that you've stumbled into the heart of a cursed place. You feel a sudden icy chill race down your spine, and you freeze in terror. The hair on the back of your neck stands on end as you sense a presence directly behind you, so close that you can feel its cold breath on the nape of your neck. A voice, low and menacing, whispers in your ear, "I've been waiting for you." You try to run, to escape this unseen terror, but your legs won't move. Your body is paralyzed, completely at the mercy of this dark and powerful force. You can feel your heart pounding in your chest, your breaths coming in short, rapid gasps. You try to scream, to call for help, but no sound escapes your lips. You're completely trapped, completely vulnerable, completely at the mercy of this mysterious and malevolent entity. And then, as if on cue, ghostly apparitions begin to rise from the mist, their forms becoming clearer with each passing moment. The spirits of the children who died at the camp all those years ago have been trapped here for centuries, forced to relive the terrors of their untimely demise over and over again. Their anger is palpable, and their expressions are twisted into grotesque masks of fury. You watch in abject horror as the ghostly figures converge on the stage, their spectral hands reaching out for you. The gap between you and them closes quickly, and you can feel the chill of their presence. A putrid breath washes over you, making the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. You try to scream for help, but your voice is silenced, trapped deep in your throat. Your body feels heavy, like it's being weighed down by an unseen force. And as the ghostly figures close in, you realize that there's no escaping the horrors that await you within the heart of this cursed summer camp. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, you wrench yourself free from the invisible grip that was holding you captive. You spin on your heels, your heart pounding so hard in your chest that it feels like it might burst. The ghostly laughter that had been echoing in your ears grows louder and more sinister, the sound of it following you as you take off in a sprint. You run as fast as you can, your feet pounding the ground beneath you. You don't dare look back, not even for a moment, knowing that if you do, you'll be met with the sight of the ghostly apparitions that were once reaching for you. The laughter continues to follow you, echoing through the trees, growing ever closer with each passing second. Finally, you reach the edge of the camp, and you keep running, not slowing down until you're miles away from the cursed place. You look back only once, and what you see makes you want to scream. The ghostly figures are still there waiting for you, ready to claim you as their next victim. You turn and run even faster, not stopping until you're far away from that cursed summer camp. From that day on, you never speak of your experience at the all-children's camp. You never tell a soul what you saw and what you heard in the heart of that cursed place. But every time you close your eyes, you can feel the cold breath of the ghosts on the back of your neck and hear their ghostly laughter echoing in your mind. Good night.